Thank you very much for joining us tonight at this webinar. We are very excited to have so many of you show interest in this important matters. We had more than 100 registered participants, and it's really a testament to the attention that Canadians are paying to these important issues. The eyes of the world right now, for a great part, are on the conflict in Ukraine, and with good reason. But there is a very catastrophic conflict that predates the Ukraine conflict, for that also has shown a pattern of destruction, has shown a pattern of civilian suffering, and has been fueled by the continuous provision of arms to warring parties of that conflict, and that is the conflict in Yemen. 8 years ago, started a Saudi-led intervention led by Saudi Arabia into Yemen that has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, in humanitarian suffering, in destruction of infrastructure, in forced displacement, and in a host of very dire humanitarian consequences. Part of this conflict has to do, and once again, what fuels it has to do with the continuous flow of weapons. And Canada has been one of the countries that, through it all, has supplied weapons to one of the warring parties, to Saudi Arabia. Civil society organizations in Canada and abroad have been asking questions about the nature of the arms contract that has Canada supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, about the rationale given by the government, and about the impact of these weapons in the perpetuation of the conflict and in human suffering. To this day, most of the questions that have been asked about the reasons for arming Saudi Arabia and about the compliance with the obligations, domestic and international, remain unresolved. So we have some experts today to discuss the implications of this, the humanitarian suffering that has been felt in Yemen, and the consistency of some of these decisions of arms experts with Canada's feminist foreign policy, which has been a feature of Canadian of the government for the past few years. This webinar is organized with our partners. We are Project Plowshares, with our partners from Oxfam, Quebec, Labor Against the Arms Trade, World Beyond War Canada, and Le Collectif Échec à la Guerre, along with other civil society organizations. We are very pleased to be able to offer this webinar in English with simultaneous translation into French. We are very fortunate to be joined by Fatma Jafar. She's based in Sana'a, Yemen, and she's joining from there. It is 2 a.m. for her there, so we're very grateful for her making the time. She's policy and advocacy lead for Oxfam Yemen. She has more than 7 years of experience with work in fragile contexts and has extensive experience in partnership management with various humanitarian organizations in humanitarian settings. We also have Jennifer Patterson. She's based in Ottawa, Ontario. She works at the intersection of politics and policy. Her roles have included Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor for a Canadian non-governmental organization, and 8 years working on the foreign affairs and international development files with the New Democratic Party of Canada. She holds a PhD in international politics from Aberystwyth University, and has published on women and war, the arms trade, peace activism in Liberia, and tribal conflict and mediation in Yemen. And myself, Cesar Jaramillo, I'm based in Waterloo, Ontario. I have been the executive director of Project Plowshares for more than 7 years, and with the organization for close to 14. My work has focused on such areas as the arms trade and conventional arms controls, nuclear disarmament, outer space security, and the humanitarian impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. So we look forward to a wonderful discussion, and to having some very well-informed perspective. I encourage all of you to use the Q&A function and to write down your questions, because we are going to leave time at the end to try to address some of the questions that you may have that perhaps are not addressed in the course of the interventions. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Fatma, and Fatma will speak to us for approximately 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will proceed with the program. So Fatma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cesar, and thank you for all of the people who made it to the webinar. I hope you can hear me clearly. I just need a few seconds to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes. Yes, I'll be happy to present for you some of the humanitarian impacts of the war in Yemen. Just to bring you a little bit of a background on how the conflict erupted in Yemen. So the war in Yemen is viewed as an international proxy between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's involving only Ansar Allah Houthis who are based in the northern part of Yemen, and the international recognized government who is controlling the southern part in Yemen. The conflict basically erupted in Yemen. The conflict erupted in Yemen in 2015. And the government had to flee to the southern part of the country, and the de facto authorities, which are represented by Houthis, took over the government in 2015. The situation is a bit complex. Not only is the countries represented by the international recognized government and the Houthi group, we have also other actors in the scene. We have the Southern Transitional Council, which is calling for the separation of the country. We have also some activities that from ICAP, which is basically Al-Qaeda, and we have also other local conflicts that appeared after the conflict erupted in 2015. The outside arming and how did the conflict was fueled. We know that the Yemeni conflict is more of a regional conflict than it's an international conflict. There is a lot of actors who are participating in the Yemeni conflict. The US and the UK are the largest arms suppliers to Saudi Arabia. And also the Houthis have managed to get access to some of the arms that were lost during the collapse of the government. So they have over 500 million arms that are in their control. The UAE is also one of the main actors in the Yemeni conflict. Their main suppliers of the weapons is US and France, and Houthis are practically, technically supported by Iran. As you know, Oxfam has intervened in support of the CAT of the first judicial review that happened in the UK arms sales. We have launched a report back in January that basically shed the light of the humanitarian impacts of the conflict in Yemen. And we tried to analyze what was happening and what is exactly the arms sales impacts on the Yemeni conflict. And it came in line with a court case that Oxfam was participating as a witness in January 2023, earlier this year. Canada have also been part of the fueling the conflict in Yemen. Reports say that by 2021, Canada have exported 1.7 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. So types of arms that were used in the Yemeni conflict, there are many types of arms that were used in the Yemeni conflict. It includes airstrikes, missiles, drone attacks, landmines, and light weapons. The major and the most significant one was the airstrikes and the artillery use that caused most of the damage to the country. There have been weapons that are banned by the International Convention of Law, and it also affected a lot of civilians in the different parts of the country where bombs, missiles, shells, and other exclusive weapons were used in the Yemeni conflict. Just to give you a little bit of background on the human impact of the Yemeni conflict, the analysis that we have carried shows that there are over 1,727 incidents that affected civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure since 2015 and until now. We have also over 2,600 civilian casualties. 32% of the attacks come from artillery, and over 25% comes from airstrikes. Another analysis says that over 85% of the civilian harm is caused by explosive weapons and 15% by small arms. 22% of the attacks involve the displacement of civilians, and about 760 incidents in only 40 months. A lot of incidents involved psychological trauma, and this data has all been measured by SIMP, which is an online platform provided by the UN. And there's a total of over 1,500 incidents that suffered from psychological trauma as a result of the conflict. During the conflict, there are over 700 attacks, restricted freedom of movement, and this has also affected heavily the movement of humanitarian workers in the country. There are over 1,200 attacks that were made on populated areas, 600 directly targeted homes, and destructions of multiple homes at least twice in the 14 months of the study that we have carried. Explosive weapons were used in more than 100 attacks per month, directly impacting civilians. And these attacks have caused the death of over 600 civilians and 1,500 civilian injuries. The food production have also been severely impacted because of the conflict. Farms have been attacked, and this comes, with all of the other humanitarian impacts like climate change, like restrictions on imports, and all of the other factors. Which also adds to the food situation in the country. There are over 5 incidents that were recorded for fishing boats that were fired with missiles and small arms. And there are over 174 cases of farms that were attacked as a result of the conflict. Here we carried a small analysis on what were the types of harm that was caused to civilians. So you can see that because of the conflict, there are over 22% displacement that happened in the country. And this displacement occurs in the main front lines where the military situation is escalating, especially in Marib, Taiz, and those areas that are in constant confrontation between the international recognized government and the Houthi group. One of it is also restricted access. This comes as a result of the closure of the roads because there are governorates that are controlled by both parties of the Yemeni conflict. So this will have also impacted the access and movement of civilians and also impacted the movement of humanitarian workers. Losses of livelihoods have also been one of the impacts. Over 7% of those livelihoods have been as a result of the use of weapons. Restricted movement and assembly takes 21%, and the psychological trauma takes over 45%. As you know that Yemen have, it was the first time that we have been into a truce. The truce lasted for over 6 months, and it was led by the UN. It was not renewed, but relatively the situation is calm in the country. There is fighting that erupts every once in a while, especially in the main front lines where the conflict is intense. But during this that was announced in April, it ended in October, but it was not renewed. There is ongoing negotiations between the different stakeholders of the conflict. During the average number of violent incidents have reduced from an average of 123 per month to 98, which is 21% less than the year leading to the truce. There has also been reduction in the casualty figures, which average deaths dropping from 60% in the period to over 46. Also, we have seen that there have been less displacement as a result of the de-escalation of the conflict. But still, at the same time, there was a lot of incidents that harmed civilians, mainly the IED attacks on different markets, and also the attacks, the casualties that were impacted as a result of the landmines that were planted by the different political parties in the country. So landmines have played a major role in the number of casualties that were reported during the truce. The Yemeni conflict has special impacts on women. Yemeni women have suffered from gender inequality way before the conflict erupted in 2015, mainly as a result of conservative social norms, and unfair legal systems. But the impacts on women have been very severe after 2015. One of the main impacts that women had less access to medical care. As a result of the conflict, only 51% of the health facilities in Yemen are operational. There is also lack of access to clean water, and 23% of the water networks have been destroyed as a result of the Yemeni conflict. Yemeni women didn't have great participation in the political path of the country, but it went way worse after the conflict erupted in 2015. We do not see women being represented in senior political positions within the government, and they're not part of the ongoing peace negotiations in the country. The impact have also caused a lot of displacement. Over 80% of the displaced populations are women and children, and this have also put women into a lot of risks associated with gender-based violence and early marriage and girls dropping out of school as a result of poverty and the economic deterioration that the country has went through since the conflict erupted. After 2015, there is an increase of 66% of girls dropping out education, and 50% of the girls in Taiz were left without education, because Taiz was one of the most affected governorates during the Yemeni conflict. The humanitarian delivery was also impacted. The funding situation is severely short for Yemen. This year, the UN was calling for an appeal for 4.3 billion, but the current funding that we have received in the pledging conference that took place in Geneva in February, we maintained 1.2 billion. As a result, also with the closure of roads, for example, the roads around Taiz, it's closed. It's a city that is controlled by the de facto authorities and also the international recognized government. The closure of the roads have caused a lot of impacts on civilians. It increased the cost of transportation. People have to move what took them 15 or 10 minutes to move from different districts within Taiz governorate now takes them 8 to 7 hours. And this impacts their access to health services, because part of the city that is controlled by the de facto authorities is under a state that the Taiz have experienced for the past. So also limited people access to water sources. All of this have also had direct attacks. There is also direct attacks that targeted aid organizations, and this is something that Oxfam has experienced in 2015. Part of the impacts that we have faced as a result of the war is restrictions impacting women aid workers. In November, it was announced by the authorities that women humanitarian workers are not allowed to travel without having a male family guardianship, which is what they call mahram. And this have impacted severely our interventions and impacted the quality of our work and our reach to women and girls in the most impacted communities. There have also been a lot of IHL violations, and those violations have been made by all sides of the conflict. And those violations were serious breaches of the international law by the United Nations. There have been several national NGOs, UN agencies, and different NGOs who've documented those violations that happened during the Yemeni conflict. There have been attacks that targeted civilian populations, especially the airstrikes. It targeted buildings. It targeted religion centers, education facilities, and health facilities within the country, and those were civilian facilities that were not used for any military objectives, which caused a lot of damage to the infrastructure of Yemen. There have been attacks that fail to distinguish between military forces and civilians, and this have caused a lot of losses within Yemeni civilians. Another thing that the Yemeni conflict have suffered from, which is the lack of accountability in such an intense context, and as the Yemeni conflict doesn't only involve Yemeni warring parties, but it's also conflict. There is a lack of accountability and lack of accountability mechanisms available to control the violations that have been made by the different political parties in the country. The UN group have established the eminent expert, but it was shut down earlier in 2019, which also a big disappointment because it was documenting IHL violations that were happening by the conflict parties. Since the conflict erupted in 2015. This group also haven't been re-established or renewed to continue their documentation of the different violations that were happening. The government have established the jihad, which is an investigative mechanism. It's responding to mainly concerns about potential serious IHL violations, but it's mainly supported by the international recognized government, which doesn't give it the impartiality that we are seeking, and it's mainly based in the south, so it has limited access to northern part of the country. So our main messages in the Yemeni conflict that we call that all parties must stop fueling the war, and arms and technology transfer to all of the parties in Yemen must stop. There is clearly a lot of countries have committed to the IHL violations, but it's still happening. So we call all of the parties that have participated to stop fueling the Yemeni conflict. We are also calling for a clear need for a full ceasefire. We do not want a truce that lasts 6 or 8 months. We want a long-lasting peace agreement, and it must be an inclusive peace agreement that includes all of the different impacted parts of the conflict, and especially including Yemeni women in the negotiation table. The parties must adhere also to the obligations under the international humanitarian laws when it comes to targeting populated areas and to relocate military camps and warehouses outside of populated areas and cities to prevent harms on civilians and infrastructure. There must be an end on the attacks of civilian and civilian infrastructure in populated areas where we must prioritize the safety for all Yemenis. We also called the UN that they must establish an effective independent accountability mechanism that provides justice and documents war against Yemeni civilians. And their reports should be taken into account to hold the parties accountable for all of the committed violations that were committed. We also called the government to ensure funds available to IHL mandated agencies, INGOs, and Yemeni NGOs. And we called the UN member states to fully fund the humanitarian response plan to ensure that we have proper access for aid delivery in the country. This is it from my side. Please feel free to ask any question that might arise.
Thank you very much, Padma, for that thorough overview, and I believe that it paints a very dire picture of the impact of this conflict in Yemen on Yemenis, on the civilian population, on their lives and livelihoods, on the infrastructure, and I will go back to the first one of your messages near the end, which was the notion of stopping fueling the war by outside parties transferring arms to the parties to the conflict. And I think that is a message that not only you have made, but that we share, and that at very high levels has been made, including at the very heart of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations through the group of eminent experts on Yemen, which has unambiguously called for a stop to arms transfers to all parties. So thank you very much for that. I will attempt to give a bit of an overview now on the on the arms transfer, specifically from a Canadian perspective. As Fatma has noted, various countries have been supplying arms to parties in the conflict in Yemen, including among others the United Kingdom and the United States. But of course, for Project Vouchers, a key focus has to do with the decisions of our government here in Canada, and the impact that those decisions have on humanitarian suffering, for instance, in the conflict in Yemen. In our analysis, this is, and to use very colloquial language at the outset, this is a story of a deal no matter what. This is a deal that the Canadian government has resisted every and all calls for suspension, for cancellation, and despite the overwhelming presence of red flag after red flag after red flag, that it, for any reasonable observer, would constitute grounds for canceling or suspending this deal. But this is not a matter of or opinion or interpretation. This is a matter of compliance with the law, with domestic and international regulations. So this is not, even though of course peace movements are behind the call for cancellation, this is not based on a sort of softy base sense of a desire of wishful thinking. This is a matter of compliance with the law. And I will say something that I will reiterate shortly. Canada right now finds itself in non-compliance of domestic and international obligations, including the International Arms Trade Treaty. It is in breach of the Arms Trade Treaty, and we have repeatedly made that case, and we will continue to make that case because that is the case. In 2014, in February of 2014, on Valentine's Day, Canada initially announced that it had secured this $14.8 billion deal with Saudi Arabia. And what was not said at the time, of course, was that the nature of the nature of the recipient should raise questions about the very authorization of that deal. So there are three aspects that I would highlight from that initial announcement. One, the magnitude of the deal. This was indeed and continues to be the largest ever arms export contract that Canada has ever been part of. Up to this point, and since the start of the Yemen conflict, we have already exported more than $8 billion of weaponry to Saudi Arabia, and this is during the conflict. If you compare to the same period before the conflict, it constitutes an increase of more than 600% in terms of the weapons that Canada was exporting to Saudi Arabia. So not only do we see the sheer value, but it is also an impressive increase in the level of weapons to Saudi Arabia, to the extent that today Saudi Arabia, not including the United States, which has historically been the main recipient of military exports by Canada, not including the United States, Saudi Arabia is by far the largest recipient of Canadian military exports. So Canada is arming the largest recipient of military exports. Canadian military exports is one of the world's worst human rights pariahs. And this takes me to the second point: the nature of the recipient. Saudi Arabia, by any modern standard, is a human rights pariah. Every authoritative organization in the world that tracks human rights consistently places Saudi Arabia at the very bottom of any ranking. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House. Freedom House has a special ranking they call the worst of the worst, and sure enough, every year after year they place Saudi Arabia there because of its well-documented and abysmal human rights record. And I might add, this is not a specialized knowledge. This is well-documented, well-reported, common knowledge that the Canadian government and every other government and civil society organizations for years have been aware of this abysmal pattern of human rights abuses. In fact, at high levels, including at the group of eminent experts on Yemen that I mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia has been denounced for its widespread and systematic targeting of civilians. And there is another term for that: war crimes. So indeed, Canada has been arming a war criminal. This same group of eminent experts from that reported to the UN Human Rights Council, and unfortunately has now been disbanded, in its latest report of 2020 specifically named Canada as a contributor to the conflict in Yemen. and specifically called on Canada and on other arms exporters to immediately cease all exports to any of the warring parties. But of course, that message has fallen on deaf ears, and the exports have continued. Indeed, the year before that report, in 2019, which was when Canada made the welcome move of joining the International Arms Trade Treaty, Canada had already increased its level of exports to Saudi Arabia and exported almost $3 billion in weapons in that year alone. And the third point that I think is important to highlight in this context is that this is not, once again, a matter of an absence of norms. This is a matter of non-compliance. In the process of Canada joining the Arms Trade Treaty, Canada also took the opportunity to update its national legislation around arms exports through Bill C-47, and it was admittedly strengthened. And we had the privilege and the opportunity to be part of the process to see the strengthening of Canadian legislation. So both the domestic norms and the international treaty to which Canada is part of, the Arms Trade Treaty, are very good on paper, if you will. They're robust. The norms are there. The aspirations are there. They point in the right direction. So it is not a matter of having weak legislation to comply with. It is that we are not complying with robust legislation. These are very clear norms. And at the heart of them is the concept of risk. And despite having several provisions and articles and obligations, just on the risk front, the formulation is rather straightforward. If there is a substantial risk of misuse, you do not export. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we have seen time and again instances where the risk of misuse becomes very clear and apparent. What have we heard from the Canadian government? That they have seen no credible evidence of misuse. And this, in fact, is the title of a report that Project Publishers we produce with our colleagues at Amnesty International Canada, because even though the government says there is no credible evidence of misuse, indeed, the threshold and the criteria established by international arms control obligations and domestic ones is not evidence. In fact, the word evidence does not even appear once in the Arms Trade Treaty or in domestic legislation. The threshold is risk, and we have seen plenty of that, and it has been well documented. But even this higher standard that the government points to, evidence has been found. And there is evidence of the Saudi proclivity to use weapons against civilians. The Saudi there is evidence of Saudi using armored vehicles against civilians. There's evidence of Saudi Arabia using vehicles outside of its territory against civilians, or allegedly they have been using, for instance, in the context of Bahrain protests before the Yemen conflict, and within its borders. Even there have been reports, very credible reports, of using armored vehicles in the eastern province in Awamiya to repress protests in which scores of civilians have been killed and armored vehicles have been. So it's not a matter of an absence of norms alone, but also it's not a matter of an absence of evidence. We have the norms, we have the obligations, and we have the evidence. It's a matter of not complying with these norms. In the case of the back and forth, or in the context of the back and forth between civil society organizations, Canadian civil society organizations, and the government in our repeated calls for a suspension or a cancellation of this deal through direct conversations with the government, through media appearances, through op-eds, etc., we have heard a series of arguments that we're not that persuaded about from the Canadian government. For instance, early days, the government, one of the very egregious arguments that we heard was that if we don't arm Saudi Arabia, somebody else will. And not only is this argument devoid of any ethical considerations. If we don't arm the bad guy, someone else will. So we might as well do it ourselves. Which is, of course, we're not persuaded by that. But that very argument was less and less true, because other countries indeed where one after the other starting to change their own decisions about arms exports to Saudi Arabia in the context of the conflict in Yemen, in the conflict of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist that the Saudi regime murdered brutally at the consulate in Istanbul. So not everyone else would be willing to do what Canada is doing and continues to be doing in terms of arming Saudi Arabia. We have also heard that there may be penalties to be paid in case Canada doesn't follow up fully with the contract to supply Saudi Arabia with weapons. But we're also not persuaded that the fear or the possibility of penalties is a good enough reason, a sufficient reason to continue down a path that is one of non-compliance with domestic and international law. And even if the penalties are there, we wonder about what the nature and the wording of the contract is. We have not seen it that would bind Canada so strongly that it would not have any ability to react in the face of human rights violations, in the face of misuse, in the face of evidence that the Saudi regime was misusing the exports. We have heard the economic benefits. These are true. Jobs are, of course, this is the $15 billion jobs are going to be either created or maintained or sustained. But once again, nowhere do domestic or international regulations make exemptions for job creation. Once again, the criteria is the risk of misuse, and when there is a substantial risk of misuse, the arms exporter should not proceed with the authorization of the export. And of course, there are other strategic considerations that the Canadian government in various ways has alluded to, including the strategic value, the purported strategic value of an alliance with Saudi Arabia in the region and in the fight against terrorism, as a bulwark against Iranian influence in the Middle East, etc. And this may be, you may afford the value you will to these considerations, but I cannot stress enough how, from the perspective of arms control regulations and legislation at the international and domestic level, these are not valid considerations. There are no exemptions. Really, the fact of the matter is that Canada has every prerogative to end these arms deals by adjusting to the law, by referring to the law, and by coming to compliance with the law. So this is to this day we have repeatedly posed these questions, received the answers that are not satisfactory, and in the context of this grim anniversary of the invasion of the military intervention in Yemen, we feel it is high time to find some answers to these questions and to bring Canada into compliance with their export obligations and out of the possible complicity with human rights violations. So I will turn it over to Jennifer Patterson to give us her perspective on how this aligns with Canada's feminist foreign policy, among other issues. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Cesar. And I think it's really important for us to be having this conversation on this devastating anniversary and to start being honest as Canadians about what kind of foreign policy we have and what kind of foreign policy we want to see, to imagine some of the possibilities of a transformational foreign policy, one that's feminist, one that's based on human rights, that's based on peace, and on social and economic justice. And to be clear, a good feminist foreign policy would benefit everyone, not just women. It suggests that all people are equal and that damaging social and economic inequalities should be transformed for the betterment of everyone. And it's supposed to be an integral part of every part of Canadian foreign policy right now. It's supposed to be part of our trade, our diplomacy, our development, and peace and security efforts. Now, Canada is not the only country to have a feminist foreign policy. Sweden, France, and now Germany's new social democratic government, those are all countries with thriving arms and defense industries. And despite all the questions Canadian civil society and opposition parties have asked over the last several years, we don't yet have an articulation of what Canada actually means when it uses the phrase feminist foreign policy. We do have speeches, we do have announcements, but in 2020, the Foreign Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, promised that we would also get an actual policy document that would outline the way the Liberals see feminist foreign policy, and that has still not been released. And in the absence of that fleshed out foreign policy, it's hard to interpret what they mean by feminist. Is it a small L liberal feminism, which is simply add women and stir, and then we have the same programs as always, or is it a more transformational and bold policy? I encourage everyone to read the great document, Be Brave, Be Bold, which was a series of recommendations from the Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group, made up of a number of civil society and feminist advocates across Canada. And in this document, you will find sections on disarmament, on human rights, on economic justice, and on international assistance. And it's a really great discussion of what Canada should be doing. Now, I want to say Canada has done some things well with its new feminist foreign policy. Certainly, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, or the FIAP, has made significant changes to the way Canada does development assistance. We have great funding now for sexual and reproductive health and rights, for women human rights defenders, for women's organizations, grassroots women's organizations, and also for the Equality Fund. And even on the peacekeeping side, there has been a small change with the ELSI initiative, which aims to include more women in peacekeeping operations. But I would argue that there are several areas still where the Canadian government is not doing well with its feminist foreign policy. And the first would, of course, be, trade and prioritization of extractives over human rights. That's an ongoing problem with gendered consequences. But the main one, and the one we're here to talk about tonight, is this question of disarmament and demilitarization and Canada's arms sales record, including to Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to rely here on the words of Alison Pitlack from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who wrote in this Be Brave, Be Bold document the great set of recommendations on disarmament. And she argues, and I quote, "Demilitarization is a vital feminist foreign policy principle, and a fundamental component of demilitarization is disarmament. Research and lived experience show us that the production, use, trade, and proliferation and possession of weapons is incompatible with a feminist foreign policy framework." So it's clear to me and to many other feminist scholars and activists and to folks within the peace community that when it comes to arms exports and human rights, Canada's feminist foreign policy has been inconsistently applied and frankly suffers from cognitive dissonance. And not only is Canada continuing to send these billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia, Canadian trade officials are also promoting the Canadian arms and defense industry in a number of markets globally, including other countries in the Middle East that have been part of the coalition operating in Yemen. And this has led folks to ask really important questions. I love this phrase by Serjan Vucetic from the University of Ottawa, who wrote a great article a few years ago, who asks, is Canada now a nation of feminist arms dealers? And then there's, of course, the great Stephen Lewis, who back in 2016 was asking these big questions. What kind of feminism is it that sells weapons to a government steeped in misogyny? And we know Saudi Arabia is one of the worst countries in the world to be a woman. It's also one of the worst countries in the world to be a dissident or human rights activist. And the kingdom's answer to those who criticize the government or demand their rights is often imprisonment or execution. And I want to mention Loujain Al-Hafloul, who was a graduate of the University of British Columbia, a Saudi citizen who was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison for simply advocating for the right of women to drive a car. And we have untold stories of the harm the Saudi regime has caused not only to its own people, but also to the folks in Yemen. And Fatma really gave us a clear description of how this impacts on the impacts of the war, on women and girls. And many have argued over the past several years that the Trudeau government's reluctance to cancel this $15 billion light armored vehicles deal is, in the face of these egregious human rights violations, should call into question its commitment to the feminist foreign policy. But we also need to ask the question of whether this makes Canada, frankly, complicit in the war crimes that we're seeing in Yemen, which again has had devastating effects on civilians, including gendered consequences. And beyond this question of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, I think we need to be asking whether, a real feminist anti-militarist approach would lead us to ask whether we need an arms industry at all. And there was an excellent article a few years ago by Ellen Gutterman and Andrea Lane, in which they really question whether Canada's arms industry is actually contributing to security or whether it's contributing to international insecurity. But while we're having this conversation, we need to remember that Canada is not the only country where this conversation is happening. It is happening in France, it is happening in Sweden and in Germany, all countries with feminist foreign policies that export arms and have thriving defense industries, as I mentioned before. And so this is a real contradiction that feminist activists and peace activists are engaging with globally. It's a global challenge. It's not just a Canadian one. And it's a challenge where in all of these countries, domestic politics and economic pressures play a major role in determining the behavior of supposedly feminist governments. Now, despite our collective efforts over the last decade, the government, of course, has not significantly changed its policy. Yes, it has acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty, and yes, civil society like Project Plowshares and Amnesty, along with the NDP, were successful in improving the legislation so that now in the Canadian legislation, human rights criteria and gender-based violence criteria are included, and that was definitely a success. But at the same time, weapons are still flowing to Saudi Arabia from Canada. So I think we need to ask what's next. And I've been thinking about this question a lot. First, I'm really pleased to see that we have the involvement of labor now in calling for an end to this. We need to be talking about how to better support labor in Canada and demand a federal manufacturing strategy whereby Canadians are building buses and trains for our own communities rather than arms. And I also think it's time to start following the money. And this is just a suggestion to the community that's participating tonight. I'd like us to consider divestment campaigns similar to those that we have seen with cluster munitions and with landmines, campaigns that have been successful with those banned weapons. Now, of course, light armored vehicles are not banned weapons, but I do think that Canadians would be very troubled to learn that their pension plans and their investment funds are benefiting from this kind of horrendous and hurtful activity that we're seeing in Saudi Arabia and in its conduct in the war in Yemen. And we know from polling that most Canadians disapprove of the Saudi deal. So let's learn from those divestment campaigns and maybe take this back to Canadians. And let's remember also that most Canadians don't vote on foreign policy issues. And this is one of the reasons why it has been so difficult to get the government to change its tune on this. Those, frankly, that do vote on this particular issue are probably all watching the webinar tonight. So hello to you. But we need to think of new ways to reach Canadians, to put that pressure on decision makers so that we can have those Canadians say, not in my name. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you also to our other panelists, Cesar and Fatma. The panel has been lively so far. My name is Kelsey Gallagher. I'm a researcher with Project Plowshares, where I focus on the Canadian arms trade and the arms trade more broadly. We are going to move into a very quick question and answer period in a few minutes here, of which I will moderate. But beforehand, I'm going to pass the mic off to my friend Rachel. Rachel Small is a social and environmental justice and peace organizer in the Canada Organizer for World Beyond War. Rachel, please.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you to everyone who's already spoken so powerfully and just made such, I think, a strong case for why it is important that we are here today, and that, as was just highlighted by Jennifer, that we continue to bring forward this issue in new and different and powerful ways, that we show frankly, folks in Yemen, that we are not forgetting about them, that we do stand in solidarity with them, and then we continue the organizing that so many people I know in attendance here today have been part of over the last 8 years as well. So World Beyond War is a founding member of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which brings together 45 organizations across Canada working to oppose war and military violence. And I mention the network because, as I'm just going to pull up on my screen right now, this network has called days of action that were this past weekend and into today to mark these 8 years of Saudi-led war, to highlight the blood on Canada's hands, and to highlight that instead of what they could be prioritizing, like saving Yemeni lives, the Canadian government has instead focused on continuing to profit off of fueling the conflict, continuing to ship weapons of war. And so we are demanding that Canada, first of all, as everyone has said here, stop arming Saudi Arabia, but also we've been calling the Canadian government to put the diplomatic pressure it can to have the land, sea, and air blockade on Yemen be fully lifted, to get humanitarian aid, all of it that needs to get there, to the people of Yemen, to ramp up our own humanitarian assistance, and to open our doors to Yemeni refugees under the same terms as has been done for Ukrainian refugees. These are just the baseline of what needs to happen. What I want to show you is alongside some of the online information raising and events like tonight that are happening, that there's also been actions across the country this weekend. This was yesterday in Toronto. This is at Export Development Canada's office. You can't see the full crowd, but everyone trooped in, delivered letters from thousands of individual folks across Canada, as well as I believe it's 64 different organizations calling on Canada to stop arming Saudi Arabia, and highlighting organizations, institutions like Export Development Canada's role in this conflict. We also visited Global Affairs Canada's office, and we left a 40-foot long message on the outside of the building that said, Global Affairs Canada, stop arming Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry, I hope you can still see that. And to highlight, like I said, the blood that is on our hands. This conflict may be happening on the other side of the world, but if we're complicit in arming Saudi Arabia, we are complicit in some of the deaths that are happening in Yemen as well. In Vancouver, there was also a protest, and in Montreal, folks also delivered letters to the Trade Commissioner's office as part of Global Affairs Canada. There were also actions in Ottawa, in Waterloo, in Calgary. So as we gather here tonight, we're also part of a bigger movement that's been going on for many years, but also just this weekend itself across the country. Now, I would also invite you all to consider taking action with us. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. If I can find my cursor, here we are. I'm going to put a link in the chat that I hope everyone will be able to see. And if not, maybe what I'll do instead is just project the link again in case you can't see that. Bear with me one second here, folks. Okay, so you might be able to see at the bottom, there's a little link, tinyurl.com/8yearsofwar. That will take you to the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network website, where there is a tool. You can click online action, and it will make it exceedingly easy for you right now. Consider doing this as I continue to speak with you, opening an email to your member of parliament, to the Prime Minister, to the Foreign Affairs Minister, and a number of other relevant people in the Canadian government, encouraging them to do exactly as I've said, to take seriously what has been shared in this webinar, to change Canada's foreign policy, and immediately right now to stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. If we're serious about solidarity with Yemen, if we're serious about a feminist foreign policy, this is the absolute least that we could do right now. So that's my pitch if you'd like to join us in taking that online action. I also know that there were a number of people here on this call who also participated in person over the weekend, and I see some of you here. So thank you for continuing to be part of that, and I hope you'll share with all of us your ongoing work on this issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for those words from the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. And thanks everyone for posing so many questions in the chat. It's a good problem to have. There's always more than we can get to. And we are coming up against the clock here, and just to respect the time of our interpreter, I think I'm going to pose one question, and we'll do a go through of our panelists, and a question that collates multiple questions that were kind of posed. And I would say anyone that would like to pose questions, feel free to get certainly in touch with me, certainly in touch with anyone from Project Plowshares. I can't speak for our panelists, but we'd be more than happy to discuss. So generally speaking, and we'll ask all of our panelists to touch on this if they feel comfortable, what does Saudi Arabia, as Canada's largest consumer of weapon systems, what do they really want to get out of not only this conflict in Yemen, which they have been in large part spearheading for 8 years, but what do they want to get out of the weapons that they're procuring in large volumes, not only from Canada, but also from many of Canada's allies? And in addition to that, on the other side of the coin, what does Canada want to get out of arming Saudi Arabia, a country which it legitimately calls a human rights pariah, but continues to be one of its largest shippers of conventional arms? So take that question how you will. I'll give it to our panelists, and whoever wants to start, please take it away.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you for posting the questions. I know it was a very rich Q&A section here. Just what Canada might want to get out of this. I mean, I would say that some of the reasons that I said the government has alluded to, though irrelevant to arms control legislation, they're not false. I mean, I believe perhaps Canada does want to maintain a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. It does see it as a bulwark against Iran. I mean, it's no secret that Canada, there is a certain antagonism against Iran, and in the regional setting, Saudi Arabia is traditionally the ally of Canada and of other NATO partners, of the United States, of the United Kingdom, from that strategic perspective. But at the same time, these laws exist for a reason. It's not an open-ended check. The strategic alliance cannot sort of overturn or override any other considerations, including human rights violations, including compliance with the law, including our record, including our impact in the world. So there's a point at which you draw a line in the sand, and we believe that line is compliance with domestic and international laws and against the arms exports. Because the question is, if a country with a pattern of human rights violations and the proclivity to use arms exports against civilians, as Saudi Arabia is eligible to continue receiving Canadian weapons, then who would not be? Because they set the bar impossibly low.
Jen or Fatma, if you'd like to take a swing, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think I'll defer to Fatma in terms of what's happening on the ground between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Thanks so much.
Yes, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks all. I think it's a very complicated question because Saudi Arabia and Yemen had a long history of conflict because we share the same border, and mainly there is the reason of the conflict that is happening between Saudi Arabia and Yemen is also Saudi Arabia trying to protect its borders from Iran. So basically, it's a regional conflict, but it's taking place in Yemen. It's Saudis and Emiratis trying to push back on the Iranian influence in the Middle East. And as the de facto authorities who are based in the northern part of Yemen and are strongly supported by Iran, is placed in the northern part of Yemen. They have started expanding after 2008, and as the conflict erupted and as the revolution started in Yemen in 2011, Houthis, the de facto authorities, in 2015 managed to take control over the north, which has the most density of population within Yemen. So those people were getting all of the technical support from Iran, and basically this threatened Saudis in terms of protecting their borders from any Iranian intervention. and Yemen was caught up in the middle of this chaos that took place. And as you know, Yemen is already one of the poorest countries in the region. So the conflict have only put a lot of burdens on Yemeni civilians, and it's also brought a lot of gender inequality within the country, because the conflict is 8 years. We have witnessed a lot of economic shocks that were mainly a result of the war. So the Saudi Yemeni conflict has its own history, but we're hoping that the current negotiations that are happening between Iran and KSA might bring some peace to the country.
Absolutely, and I think we couldn't agree more that however it comes about, peace in Yemen is, I mean, ultimately the goal here. So with that, and there is so much more to be said, and I'm always chomping at the bit to jump in, and I think we all are, but we will have to end it there. So first and foremost, I just want to say thanks to our panelists. Fatma, calling in, I don't know if you'd say it was late or early. I mean, it's at the extreme ends of one of those, but thank you so much for joining us. Jen, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, Cesar, thank you, as well as Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us to provide those comments. I'd also like to thank the other civil society organizations. I mean, this really was a collective effort to put on this event. So that includes us Plowshares, but just as much Oxfam Quebec, Labor Against the Arms Trade, World Beyond War Canada, and Le Collectif Échec de la Guerre. I mean, you know, this was really a collective effort, and the effort includes other organizations as well. So I would just, like to say in summary, thank you so much. If there's anything, questions that were to answer, feel free to reach out to us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night or a good morning for the case of some of us. Cheers.